I have entitled Pilgrim Ships. Have you ever wondered how long has extraterrestrials been visiting this and other planets? There seems to be irrefutable evidence of history, science, and archaeological evidence that can no longer be swept under the rug by the religious world, by atheists, agnostics, and doubting Thomases. I believe many of these mysteries can now be solved by this, your generation, using evidence in all fields and some common sense, along with an open mind. As National Geographic, Reader's Digest, and many other magazines states that there was a man-like creature that roamed this planet, along with the dinosaurs and mastodons and fertile fields and primeval forests of the ancient world when the earth was very young. If this is true, then how and why did they get there? Were they brought here by what the ancients would call evil gods from outer space? Or would we say some advanced culture and civilization beyond the scope of our imagination? There's a lot of these people who actually believe that these creatures were the leftover of some Frankenstein type laboratory, so to speak, in outer space, and that these people, I'm referring to one citizen who's written in some of his books, he seems to have a lot of evidence that they created these hybrid species in outer space, and then they dumped them off here on the earth. Take, for example, how men on this earth, you hear people in this part of the country, they talk about the Missouri mule. And in the last century, people came from all over the United States and even from Europe to see that this hybrid mule that was crossbred, breeding a jackass and a horse. Because the people in my part of the country, they believe, and I believe it's been substantiated, that you can take a mule, he'll work harder, and he can be stronger than a horse. He can work on a lot less fuel, and he will put in longer hours than a horse. So the mule, he's a hybrid. He was created to cultivate the fields and to work as a beast of burden. And so as we go back and we read a lot of these ancient epics, such as the one of Gilgamesh and other ancient writers that we've spoke of, that they talked about that this was disallowed by the higher gods or the great council. And so were these creatures or created hybrids, were they dumped off here? Are there still some remaining here of these ancient experiments still around that a lot of people say that if you want to believe in it, the Bigfoot, the Yeti, Walk Walk Oma, Stick Man, Hairy Man, and or the Yeti as the Asiatics or the Asians refer to them. There's so much of this evidence that we find very hard to ignore all of it. Then later on we have the black man, the Mongolian, and other original aborigines that were called Indians, erroneously in some cases, who go back. Some of them think that they preceded the ancient Babylonians, the Egyptians, some say possibly by tens of thousands of years. Why? And who brought them here? From whence they came, did they come? Then we have those who were gods, as they were referred to. They suddenly appeared on this earth, and they built great empires such as Babylon, which, whether we like the Babylonians, whether they were good people or bad people, I think that this is irrelevant, because we cannot refute the fact as we study the evidence of history that Babylon was a great center of science and culture, and they had knowledge of the stars, and they spoke of the highways of heaven. Now, how could they have known all of this? How could they accomplish all of this? Unless there were gods or extraterrestrial lords from space, or at least descendants of space, who wrote of them and who built these great cities. We can only wonder why and how these great cities later, they were, well, one great possibility, that were they built by the great king, who our Bible tells us that he was driven off or from his world. As Genesis tells us, he was cast to the earth, and he built a great city, and It tells us that he built a great city and then he took himself wives. Now, was this back in the days when the great line of the Sargons took over, who ruled Babylon, Egypt, and India, and then into Asia and to China? The Egyptian Book of the Dead, it speaks of the gods of Egypt, as we've cited to you before, that had enmity between what they considered the evil Seth, or what the biblical account lists as the son of Adam. Now, it seems quite evident that this was a later rival. That was the belief of the old people of Egypt. As we said, or as we shall see here, it appears that some of these of the Adamic line, there's great evidence that they came in great spaceships and they closed the places of worship in Egypt. And then it tells us again, the books of the dead, that they ascended once again to heaven, or shall we say outer space, like we have even in the biblical account, who can refute the where it speaks of the ancient Enoch, who went back to heaven without seeing death. Later on we have the account of Elijah, who was called back to outer space and then reappeared centuries later at the mysterious Mount of Transfiguration, along with Moses and Jesus. And some of the disciples were privy to this. They saw this great thing, and we understand here now transfiguration. In other words, transporting you from one place to another. But we've not questioned this. So it seems that the story seemed to have started and passed so distant and dim that the account has now become blurred to us. Can we find enough pieces of this mysterious puzzle to make a panoramic picture that'll make sense by finding the roots of the different species of mankind and their telling of their arrivals from the stars and where they migrated, or their migration took them to this planet? Now let's start with Egypt. Now let's examine a little bit of the evidence of the Pilgrim ships that landed in that land, which our modern scientists agree is the center of the earth. If there's any validity to this, where's the evidence that the star fleets landed there? And why? And did they deposit their Pilgrim ships there? Granted, the more questions that we come up with, the more questions we have. And it seems to the point of the fact that that Khan, he represented, or Cain, he didn't represent a singular person. It appears that Abel, as we've said before, was a planet which the great Khan defeated in a war of the worlds. As the parable of the blood of the earth of that distant planet, lost in the deep recesses of history, it cried out for revenge, appealing to a higher entity that might intercede on their behalf. Now you may think I'm wandering off the subject, but it's very important, I believe, that we understand what occurred in the wars of the worlds, as we shall call it, which most of the religious world has never questioned. This lengthy saga, as we shall prove later, that personages, as we've always thought in the singular, such as Adam and Job and Noah, they were not single people, but they represented vast numbers of people or nations. As we'll be delving into the mysterious book of Job, who tells of the wars of these worlds, as we've cited to you before, Revelation the 12th chapter and Jeremiah's 4th chapters, he explains Genesis 1 and 2, which otherwise we could never have guessed at the great evidence of what went on in outer space. We couldn't get this picture of history that is so broad and on such a grand scale that no one has even conceived of it until, what do we say, in our space age. I think that we will find the trouble didn't start in Babylon or Egypt, but it started millenniums ago in outer space, and now is reduced to a very small confrontation. But those of us living here now, we would say it was of no small thing because we're involved. It's rather important. Now, by comparison, though, what I'm saying with this planet, we'll find this mystery man Job here, who has many names and implications in the original language. But as I said before, most people have never taken the time to look this up. They've always assumed it was just a parable and about one man. And but I think that in the so-called book of Job, he gave us a hint about the different planets referred to allegorically. He referred to his sons and daughters getting together on feast days, as do the modern Israelites. But it seems that they stayed from the feast days, or meaning the law that was laid down by, seems, a great higher Lord of space. The first one to rebel, it would seem that it was Cain. And then did he actually destroy his brethren, referring to or representing Abel planet. As far-fetched as this may sound, we'll prove this in chapters pertaining to the subject, but I think it's very important to give you a thumbnail sketch here that we might see why these fugitives or pilgrims were they brought here. And as so many of the planets, which I believe was their original homestead, became uninhabited. And once again, I would like to remind you of the book of Jude, where it tells about these wandering ships, these fallen angels, and etc., who kept not their first estate or world. Now, why have we not all seen this before? Because the Bible is like a code book. Or you might refer to it also, in my thoughts on this, it's like a time capsule that was only to be opened, to be revealed in a certain age. As we've cited to you before, as Daniel told us in the 12th chapter here, that the Almighty told him to seal it up. It was not for his age or his time, but it was for the age and the end of time. Or when this world order here was to come to the end of itself. But now, is there a possibility that there is somebody here in this age? Because I believe we have the facilities of our hand, at our hands or fingertips, you might say, to open these things up. I believe that we have a young generation who has the mentality to conceive and to understand this and open up these books. Now, because we're aware, it's a proven fact, that not only the possibility, but we have accomplished space travel, and the knowledge that's contained in all of the ancient writings and now can be cross-referenced here, and we have the technology to understand the scientific implication of the wars and the words of old. Let us cross the centuries now to the time of Napoleon, the man who saved, a lot of people not realized it, it's my opinion, he saved a couple of keys here to the mysteries of heaven or outer space. Now we go back to the year 1798 when he and his victorious French army, they had defeated the last bastions of the Ottoman Empire, or the Turks, in the great confrontation that was called the Battle of the Pyramids. And he became the master of Egypt, as did his predecessor of several centuries before, Alexandria. Now Napoleon, he was also a great student of history, such as his predecessor Alexandria. We've discussed this in other chapters, but unbeknownst to Napoleon, his soldiers, they began using the Sphinx for a target during cannon practice, which Napoleon luckily stopped immediately, saying that the keys that unlocks the secret of how to read the symbols of heaven, such as the lion, the bear, the eagle, and so forth, the religious are probably going to think, well, now he's about to teach us astrology. Not so. The Bible tells us over and over of the ancient astronomical priests who could foretell great events and prophesy things that were to happen according to the alignment of the stars as it was promised by Scripture and so forth, but we won't get into a lot of great detail on that. But by the more ancient of great empires rising and falling. Now it's not talking about individuals, but great personage such as the Messiah is represented in the heavens. And the sign of the Messiah being born to Israel. Now the Sphinx, I believe, it holds a key as to where to start reading the great circular book of heaven called the Bible and the Stars. Now as you look at Virgo representing the Virgin, and then in the heavens also we have Leo the Lion. The ancient astronomers, they would start between these two signs and they would read clockwise. Without the grand old lady of the desert, which a lot of people are not aware of. I've even read men who are supposed to be archaeologists and so forth, and they become confounded, and they did not realize that they understood that the body of the Sphinx represented a lion, a male lion. But then the head was very mysterious. It represented a woman. Now, later of modern generations, they were still not to catch on to this clue, if not one of the greatest keys that was to unlock the language and the history of the past. So I believe that they put that there, the ancient builders of this, so that men in far-off times, if the history would be lost, they would know how to read the astronomical signs of all the heavens, which we find, as we've quoted, all of the nations of the world were aware of all of these different characters in the heaven outlined by the stars. That was to tell the future history to come. But now we find we have some more clues. If you don't go along with that, it was in the following year of 1799 when a company of Napoleon's soldiers were on demolition duty in Rosetta, Egypt. They discovered a compact slab of black basalt built into an extremely old wall. Now their work, it came to immediate halt when it appeared that there was a very perceptive lieutenant. He realized that they had found something, an ancient document that was possibly of great importance. The Rosetta Stone turned out to be the key that was to decipher the language of a culture that had been silent for approximately 1,370 years, or shall we say 1,370 years. Now on the face of the slab there was an inscription of the distant ancient language of the Greek and the Egyptian demotic script and the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and there was a pictorial system of writing which had baffled experts for centuries. Now the scholars, they leapt upon these clues that they felt it was to unlock the secrets of the hieroglyphics. Now, after many years of painstaking linguistic detective work, we find that the code was cracked. And it is so sad that a grand old hybrid lady of the desert, the Sphinx as I call her, built many centuries after the Pyramid of Giza, it lays silently in the shadow of one of the, they call it one of the last remaining seven wonders of the world. Now, surely the Almighty and His extraterrestrial watchers of old, they have tears in their eyes, as it appears so many of our generation of the sex, money, and power, they ignore the wealth of knowledge that's contained in the Pyramid of Giza that points to the secrets of heaven and immortality. Now, many men, probably, they won't use the shelves of books that are on the subject of pyramidology that's been written by men of great renown, engineers, astronomers, and scientists. And we have the mathematics, we have the science and the computer and the equipment, but the best that shall we say, the bulk of humanity out there, the only thing they know that if you build a miniature pyramid, you can sharpen your razor blades and you can preserve fruit. Well, that awesome monument, sometimes referred to as the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now, what we have to realize, there's over 80 pyramids built over a period of 1,000 years there. Most people believe between the 27th and the 18th century BC. Now, the most famous of them being Giza, one of the only three of any note or size. Now, the smaller ones, they're nothing more than ruins. But what we're concerned with is Giza, the largest, which, by the way, is mentioned in one of the books of the Bible. The clearest description can be found in Isaiah 19:19-20. In that day there shall be an altar to the Lord in the midst of Egypt, with a pillar. The Hebrew word is M-A-T-S-T-S-E-B-A-H. Correctly translated, it means a monument, at the border thereof to the Lord. and it shall be for a sign and for a witness unto the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. Now, one of the hundreds of things said about the great edifice, mainly by the scientific world of late, is that it was originally built as a beacon, like a lighthouse, to guide extraterrestrial ships to the shores of this earth. Now, originally, the shiny outward layer of bright limestone that at one time did cover this great pyramid, it had been stolen and carried away to build mosques and buildings in Baghdad and Cairo. Now Isaiah said it was a witness to the Almighty, the extraterrestrial Lord of outer space. And there are many people who believe that it may give off some sort of vibrating, pulsating signals to outer space as a beacon. It makes sense in the light of discovery of a great pyramid on Mars, which possibly, as I've looked to a lot of these pictures that were brought back, it seems that there's more than one pyramid on the face of Mars, and also, as we've cited, there's a giant face of some ancient ruler or ancient king or lord of outer space. Also, the book of Job, it represents a race of people who came from the stars and their records in this great historical account that seems to go back beyond the first recorded history. As I said before, it's the oldest book in the Bible, even before Moses and his account of history. Now, he hints at pyramids, possibly on other planets, and we're talking about Job now. He knew who built them and why. But this is another book and another subject which we hope to cover in greater detail. Let's consider a little background on the pyramid, and then especially the Sphinx, and maybe we'll be able to see the connection of the pilgrims who came in the ships to this planet, and they left evidence as to who they were and where they came from and what they left for us to puzzle over. Now, let's take another writer of old who gives us some clues. And I don't think that, I think a lot of the pyramid buffs, they've overlooked this one and not considered it. But in Jeremiah 32:18-29 states that God has set signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, even unto this day. Were there others besides the two mentioned? Now, man has puzzled for centuries as to who, why, and what could so-called primitive man with only crude tools, how could he have built these great monuments in stone? Only in this age we can speculate without being stoned or tried for heresy. Now, of course, I want to warn you, you may be losing a lot of very fair weather friends along the way who consider themselves very rational souls, such as myself, who lives here in the Ozarks, and a lot of my friends' conversation, or shall we say their wide range of contemplation, may not go beyond coon dogs, chainsaws, pick-em-up trucks, and twice barrels. Now, that's hillbilly knees for double-barrel shotguns. Like one old boy said, if it doesn't happen in this county, I don't care. Now, this is why we've lost our past. And we don't understand why we're here and where we're going and what we're supposed to be doing. Now, in order to unlock the code, as I call it, as to who, where, and why these mysterious pilgrim ships came, and to see if we're not a generation or of a lost descendants of those people that I maintain were dumped on this planet, we have to cross-check the accounts of the books of history and of the Bible, and look at the ancient Greeks and the Egyptians and the clues to the pyramid and its ancient builders. Now, who took all the time to carve out this Sphinx? Surely not because the rock was there. Was this pyramid, as some believe, a tracking beacon that could have been seen from the moon with the naked eye, appearing like a reflecting mirror or shiny star-like built by the pilots of the pilgrim ships? Was it to be a beacon that could lock on to that they could lock onto the earth with their instruments as a visual highway marker. And what other secrets does it hold? It appears that the Greeks, as we go back and we check their history, they were taught by a mysterious people and culture that they came in contact with, who said that the building of the mysterious monument was directed by a strange people who suddenly appeared in the land of Egypt, then mysteriously disappeared. The Greeks were in touch with the ancient civilization of what they call the Ugarit. They were the descendants, so they claimed, of the old pyramid builders. Or did they just return to space to eventually, let's say return here at some future date with some more pilgrims? Or to stop mankind from blowing up the earth and setting off chain reaction in our solar system where we could not possibly ever recover from. As we travel back to the age of Giza, we find ourselves in the time of Pharaoh, in whose reign the great pyramids were built, called Khufu by the Egyptians and also called Cheops by the Greeks. Many people erroneously, they give credit for building of the monument. Not so. Khufu was the second king of the fourth Egyptian dynasties. All of this is supported by the great Greek Herodias, who lived during the period of 485 to 425 BC. Now, according to Will Durant, who wrote The Life of Greece and countless other great works, I personally believe Herodias and other Greek scholars picked up their information from the forgotten Utaric culture. Besides Herodias, there were others that point to the fact that there were strangers who came to Egypt during the reign of Khufu, and they supervised the building of the Great Beacon Pyramid. One note that I might make a point of at this time, that there are those of just recent times who claim that the building blocks of the Great Pyramid were not cut out of a quarry, but were manufactured like one would a great cement block. There are mysteries in Egypt. Another one that still puzzles the world, the Great Pyramid of Saqqara, said to be the first large stone building ever raised on earth. It is claimed that it was constructed by King Zoser. The experts claim that there is only 100 years difference between Zoer's and the Cheops Pyramid. The difference is so extreme that they could not possibly have been supervised by the same engineers or builders, if you like. It's my personal opinion that Zoer's was possibly a later bad copy. Now, Herodias, who has been called the father of history, wrote that Cheops reigned 50 years, and that his brother Sephron, who succeeded to the kingdom, reigned approximately 56 years. Thus, it adds 106 years are reckoned, during which the Egyptians suffered all types of calamities. And for this length of time, the temples were closed and never opened. Sounds like they were troubled by priestcraft, who we might say their dog and pony show was put out of business when the genuine appeared on the scene. Manetho, the Egyptian priest, explained that the temples were closed during the time of the Shepherd King. That's from Corey's Ancient Fragments, page 68. He writes thus, that there came from the east, in a strange manner, men of an ignoble race, who had the confidence to invade our country and easily subdued it by their power without a battle. All this nation, continues Manetho, was styled Hyksos, or the Shepherd Kings. The first syllable, HYC, according to the sacred dialect, it denoted a king. Now we might stop at this point, and something that I've quandered over quite a number of years, and I think about the wise men who came to the birth of Christ. As the scripture says, we saw his star in the east. And the predominance of Christendom and the historians, I don't believe that they've ever guessed that It was at this time that Venus moved into close proximity to our planet. As we said, that there seems to be confirmation from what I've understood that the great star, as it's still called by the world, the planet Venus, which I maintain is the house of the Almighty, that it moved in very close proximity between our sun and moon, blocking out the light to the Egyptians and so forth. And as we have cited, it seems to come closer, appear in many other instances. Now, unfortunately, most of the present-day religious world are not acquainted with Bullinger's works, which in the last century people lauded him as one of the great scholars. And one other point before I continue here, I want to remind you that I said that it had a great deal to do with Gideon and supposedly stopping the sun. Well, the sun's not going anywhere. It's the center of our universe, and we're all rotating around it. So we hope to cover this in a greater depth about Gideon in a later tape. But the thought comes to me that man has never guessed, or even bothered to guess in his wildest dreams, that these great kings that came to the birth of Christ and brought their token presents, which have a lot of symbology in themselves, that these were kings from other worlds and other places that came here. Because as we go back, speaking of Bullinger, as we get to study the ancient astronomy, and you remember it was the great astronomer priest that went and tipped off Herod that the Messiah was to be born. Now, how did they know this? Well, it seems that all of the history and the ancient astronomical maps of the old world, they showed that when what is called Virgo, and it represents Virgo the Virgin, we find that there was a period there where Aquilus the eagle, this star was to move into the head area of Virgo the Virgin, and then later on, after a period of time, would drop down into what would be known as the womb area, telling Earthman that there was something of a great magnitude here that was to take place, that was to change this world, that the Almighty Incarnate was to be born, who was to be called the Son of God, the one that the prophets of old, Isaiah, spoke of. Unto us a child is born, a son is given, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And it goes on to say the government would be upon his shoulders, and he was Emmanuel, meaning the God, the Heavenly Father, dwelling with us, incarnate as a Son. But we have to remember that the ancients, the reason that they hated him, because as it prophesied, he would come in the Father's name. And we find the Greeks called him Yeshua. And the religious world today, when they sing Hallelujah, this is short for Yahweh, the ancient God of Israel, of the Adam descendants. And so he did indeed come in the Father's name. But now continuing on, it is my opinion that the greatest clue that's overlooked by the scholars for centuries, two thoughts on this subject. We have said that a lot has been lost as the account has passed back and forth between the different nations and the cultures and the language of the ancient Greek. And we find that even the old Hebrew and the ancient Greek, it's lost to the modern. And then they start to mix it with the Latin, with the Aramaic, which a lot of these scholars say was the ancient Chaldean language, and the Hebrew and the Ugaritic. And when they got the king part right, implying that there was a great ruler from the word Hyks, H-Y-C, or space prince, I believe. This became bastardized. That's what they did to the language. They bastardized it by the vulgar tongue of the earthmen as they corrupted the languages, and they lost the ancient significance. They ran the words together. The here, a lot of them, they talks about Hyksos, S-O-S, and I believe it was a corruption of SOO apostrophe S, which would be the flying ships or the Sioux ships, as we've proved from the Hebrew and the Chaldean language. So now if there's a possibility that this is true, then this means that these two words meant a king who flies, as in the solar ships, as the Egyptians called them, or the Sioux of the ancient Hebrew or the Chaldean description of a metallic or metal type ship with pilots, as we've pointed out that they were the Cherubs or the captains of these great extraterrestrial fleets. Now let us not overlook the second clue, shepherd kings. The ancient language did not take as many words as English to tell a story. It could be compared to shorthand, as we, I believe, have shown in other chapters. The house of the Almighty in the Hebrew was called the house of the ram, depicting, I mean to say, a male sheep or the head of a herd or a flock. Now, in the following chapters, it appears Ezekiel, Gideon, and others had extraterrestrial ships that came to them with the emblem of the ram of the ship, or on their ships, that was showing that what extraterrestrial squadrons they belonged to, or possibly what area of space that they came from. So we find then that the Hyksos were the kings in space, or kings of the Sioux, kings of the eagle ships. These mysterious Hyksos, kings of the solar ships, they seem to have had some awesome control over King Cheops here, as to induce the king to shut up the idolatrous temples and to comply, or I mean to say compel his subjects to labor in the erection of the Great Pyramid under the Shepherd Prince. Now at Egypt, we find that their national religion was overturned in favor of a more simple worship of a one true God. As we know, he was called Ra. Was this actually just another meaning or name of the ancient Hebrew God Yahweh? And we find that upon completion of the Great Pyramid, ancient writings of the historians say that these foreign people withdrew, and their departure was the cause of great rejoicing among the Egyptians. The restraint being removed, the people returned with fresh zest to their idolatrous practices. Egypt tells the rest of the story on the long slide as what today we call a third-rate nation that is ruled or dominated by Russia. Now, Bible chronology and the findings of the archaeology have established the date of the start of the building of the Great Pyramid at approximately 2623 BC. Now, there's a lot of people that argue over this date. Some say that it's older, and, well, anyway, this has caused many Egyptologists to dispute today the Hyksos theory, since modern archaeologists have labeled a much later migration into Egypt as Hyksos, and they have signed a period of 1800 to 1500 BC as their domination of parts of Egypt. But we can't help but wonder, now these Egyptians were not slouches. They had learned from some extraterrestrial intervention, as they spoke of men coming in solar ships and so forth, and they had the science of astronomy and engineering feats at the day that would be very difficult for many nations of the world to match. And so we can't help but wonder what appears here, that Upper and Lower Egypt, which in its day was a great empire. So without any battle, these people submitted to these great Hyksos shepherd kings. And once again, we would remind you, as we refer back to our chapter of Jonah and his UFOs, that when there's a great mighty extraterrestrial fleet intervening from space, then they come here and they decide that they want to build a beacon or a monument or whatever it is. There's a lot of things that we could go into about this pyramid. There's been volumes written through the last 150 years. Men have devoted their life to it. And so, myself, I'm just speaking for myself, I will take the blame. I have fairly broad shoulders, and I will take the blame upon myself, but I believe that it could be built by none other than men who brought the design, the engineering, the plan, the purpose to this, And as, Isaiah 19:19 speaks of this great monument that was to be a witness to the Lord, the great Lord of space and the latter days. And in future tapes here, we're going to bring out, I believe, a lot of really fantastic, exciting, wonderful evidence and see if we can't correlate this, because even these pyramidologists, a big part of them, have overlooked what some of the other prophets of old were to say about these pyramids, and we'll find a correlation between those on our planet and on Mars. And there have been hints that they exist on some other planets throughout space. Well, it is generally agreed, however, that the beginnings of the Hyksos control of Egypt are obscure, and that during the period of the 3rd and the 4th dynasties, the Egyptians, they furnished the labor for the erection of several pyramids, culminating in the final and the Great Pyramid of Giza, also called Cheops. And by the way, the word Giza has been spelled 20 different ways, and nobody knows the exact spelling, but the name itself implies and means in the exact center of the earth, and it also seems to imply in the center beside thereof. Now Herodias, he informs us that the construction of the Great Pyramid commenced only when a sufficient force of skilled masons were available. He wrote that they worked to the number of 100,000 men at a time, each partly 3 months, and it took 20 years labor throughout some records, and add 10 years for the so-called cutting of stones and preparing the site. Now, according to Professor Flanders Petrie, 1 3-month period fell during the inundation of the Nile, when field work was at a standstill, and the service of 100,000 men could be used then for the transporting of the stone. They were easily obtained. The stone cutters and masons were probably engaged all year round in the quarries, if this is true, if it was actually quarried, but I don't want to argue about that. But anyway, the pyramid itself, it was built using a great number of people. Now Herodias, he continues, the pyramid was first built in the form of a flight of steps. After the workmen had completed the pyramid in this form, they raised other stone casings by means of machines made of short beams from the ground of the first tier of steps. And after the stones were placed there, it was raised to the second tier by another machine. For there was as many machines as there were tiers or steps, or perhaps the same machine. If it was easily moved or raised from one tier to the other, as it was required for lifting the stones, would the machines that lifted them in place possibly be airships? Now Herodias, he also states that Cheops never used the Great Pyramid as a tomb, but was buried elsewhere, namely in a subterranean region on an island surrounded by the waters of the Nile. This is confirmed by the historian Diodorus Siculius, who says Cheops was buried in an obscure place. An additional archaeological confirmation has recently been discovered, and an inscription on a scarab that was found by the Egyptologist Abdul Monim Bakar, which speaks of the southern tomb of Khufu. The southern tomb was obviously not a pyramid, which could not conform to Diodorus' inscription of the obscure place. Now both the second and the third pyramids, they were clearly intended to serve as sepulchres for the kings who built them. In historical times, well-known visitors left records of their description of the Great Pyramid, but perhaps the first modern traveler who carefully and successfully examined the pyramid was Nicholas Shaw. In 1721, he was soon followed by others, including John Graves, professor of astronomy at Oxford University. At this time, we probably ought to ask you to please turn your tape over, and you may have to turn it back just a little bit. and measurements. Now, there's been many brilliant, astute astronomers and scientists over the last 2 centuries who've devoted their lives to the science of this edifice and what it points to. But I think they've tripped over the key that unlocks the door to the secret of the pyramids. Mathematics gives us the distance to the planets and the formation of the stars and symbols of history and past and future events, prophesying even the rise and the fall of great nations. Now let us look and see if it was not a prophecy made a few hundred years ago before Christ, which told of a great event that was to occur in Egypt, causing the nation to become destitute in the last 4 decades of our present history. A brief example is found in Isaiah 19, as we have mentioned. The first verse tells of a Lord who comes in a swift cloud, or a leader of a great earthly ruler in this case. Now, this is not talking about outer space men here, but it's talking about earth men who flew to Egypt in an airplane from Russia. And the 4th verse of the chapter, the Lord of Lords tells Isaiah that he would turn the Egyptians over to a cruel Lord who would rule over them. Back to the 1st verse, he tells that he would cause the idols of Egypt to be moved out of their place. They were mostly statues of kings that had been raised to the god level by the Egyptians. I personally remember when I was a young boy in the 40s, when school children in this country, they were asked to bring their nickels and dimes and quarters to school to be sent to the National Geographic and others to move the idols out of the Aswan Dam before Russia, this cruel lord, as described by the prophet, who was to build the great Aswan Dam that was to stop the flow of the Nile, which provided fresh topsoil. Now, verse 7 tells of those that were put out of business who grew paper reeds for making fine paper. Now, verse 8 tells of the fishermen who were to trap fish in the small inlets that had been dammed up during the flood of the Nile, trapping fish and put out of business by the dam once again. Now, verse 9 tells of the growers of fine flax that were put out of business, and verse 11 tells of the ones who called themselves the sons of Pharaoh, but who had become brutish, in other words, stupid. Verse 15 tells what happened when Russia took over the government. There's no work for Egypt. Let us cite a few men through the last 2 centuries that realized that there was great astronomical significance to be found in the ancient pyramid. It was they who discovered the corner sockets peculiar to no other pyramid, and also the relationship of the pyramid structure and the dimensions to astronomical science. It was in 1817, Cavaglia, a bold but illiterate, and he was a fanciful seaman. He became intrigued by the mysteries of the Great Pyramid. He became convinced that there was still undiscovered passages to be found inside the interior of the pyramid. Now, he gave up the sea and he settled down to explore the pyramid and other neighboring monuments. No, Cavaglia never found any secret passages. His efforts in cleaning out the known passage system, it elucidated new facts that regarding the interior of the pyramid. Now, Colonel Howard Weiss, in 1830, he was the next that made significant progress in lifting the veil of mystery from the Great Pyramid, and with the help of 100 hired laborers, he cleaned the passages of the pyramid and then made measurements and observation. Now, Colonel Weiss succeeded in interesting John Herschel, the great English astronomer, who became convinced that the pyramid and its design and construction evidenced a wonderful knowledge of astronomy, applied mathematics, and other scientific information predating our recorded knowledge by several thousand years. Now, Mr. Robert Menzies of Leith, Scotland, is given credit for being the first to attract general attention to the assertion that the Great Pyramid was a treasury of divinely given wisdom embodying great chronological and meteorological and astronomical, mathematical, historical, and biblical truth. He also contended that it was a storehouse of wisdom, remained sealed by divine appointment, pardon me, to be revealed to those. Let me try that again. Now I'm over my little coughing siege. I apologize for that, but I've had a cold I haven't been able to shake for a few days. Now, he claimed that all of these things, that they were concealed by divine appointment, that was to be revealed to those now living, to whom the truth would bear witness at a time when they would be most needed. Now, I didn't write this. This is what he said. Now, is there something to it? I believe that there is. The Bible says so, and these scientists and astronomers and so forth, they must have based it on some interesting facts. Now, later we find here that John Taylor, he was a London publisher. He was a gifted mathematician and amateur astronomer. He began a study of the pyramid in order to analyze the results from a mathematician's point of view. This conclusion was that the architect of the Great Pyramid was not an Egyptian, either by race or religion. He believed it would be found eventually that the measurements and the contours of these structures and passage systems and its chambers were intended to indicate and symbolize a prophetic and historical record, especially in relationship to biblical revelation. Now, one point that I would like to make at this time, as we've cited to you, in case you have forgotten, and another tape, that I believe I'll go along with this man, because the pyramid was laid out on the ancient sacred cubit, which was 25 inches. Now, later on, this was polluted and distorted to 24 and a third or 3/4. I forget right now. It fails me, but the Egyptians were the first to bastardize these measurements. So if you're going to use something mathematical, you have to have the formula that it's based on, or it never will come out. But we'll leave that as it may. Now, it remained, however, for Professor Pizer Smythe. He was an astronomer for Scotland. He was to lift investigation and study of the pyramid into the into the realm of applied science. Now, with his wife, this astronomer, he spent several months at the Great Pyramid, directing a very large group of assistants who made scientific and accurate measurements and observation, and the results were published in 3 large volumes nearly a century ago. Now, a lot of people probably saying, what has this got to do with the Greeks? What has this got to do with pilgrim ships? What has this got to do with Homer and the Iliad? We are trying to present here and give you a cross-section for those that say, well, I don't want to hear somebody, it's just a Bible thumper that beats on the Bible. And then we have those that don't want anything to do with the Greeks. They don't want to take the time to understand that. And then there are those that are interested, and those that have not heard of the Pyramid of Giza and pyramidology. And now there's a lot of erroneous stuff, believe me, my friend. When something rises to the apex of popularity, there's all kinds of people that get in on it and try to capitalize on it. But we're trying to show you a great correlation here between astronomy and science and mathematics. So then when we do get to Homer's ships and so forth, where it appears that there's some mathematical renditions in that, then we'll be able to understand this a little better. Because it's very puzzling, as we will note later on, that where it talks about Jason, who comes back with the 50 oarsmen. Now, was he talking about in a Jubilee year? We've pointed out many other facts about cycles and their movement about the sun and astronomical measurements. There's a lot here yet to be found, and I hope that I can stir up somebody who's a good astronomer, and or more than one, hopefully, and people who are into the science who will look at this in a positive way. We cannot but believe that there are other advanced civilizations, shall we say a flying race, who can measure the earth from space, and who were able. How else would you set the pyramid in the exact center of the earth? The Great Pyramid, it was placed in the exact center of all of the land area of the world. Now we find that lines drawn through the north and the south and east and the west axes of the pyramid, they divide equally the earth's terrain. Now, the north-south axis of 31 degrees and 9 meridian east of Greenwich, which is the longest land meridian, and the east-west axis of 29, 58, and 51 north, the longest land parallel. Now, the architect knew where to find the poles of the earth, as evidenced by the high degree of accuracy in orienting the building true north. Now, modern man's best effort, the Paris Observatory, is 6 minutes of a degree off of true north. The Great Pyramid today is only off 3 minutes, and that after 4,200 years, due mainly to man's error and that very slight variation in the movement of the planets. Now, some near perfect orientation is exceedingly hard to secure, even with our modern astronomical equipment, and seemingly impossible without it. Now, if the knowledge of the magnetic needle was known, it would have been of little value. It points to the magnetic north, but not to the true north. The celestial pole is a point, usually a star, through which the polar axis of the earth would pass when it was projected to the star sphere. Now, as I was speaking just a second ago, let's go to the Pilgrim ships. Now, this series of tapes and this program that we've put out is called Pilgrim Ships, after a chapter in Bullinger's book called Argo the Ship. It helps you to understand the correlation between the signs of the celestial bodies in the Bible that refers to them over and over. Well, we'll be dealing with the celebrated ships of what they call the Argonauts, which Homer sang about 1,000 years before Christ. In this case, Homer referred to Jesus as Jason, the great captain who with his boatload of brave men looked for the golden fleece and to retrieve it from the serpent. Now, Homer's story had a great prophetic insight, telling of Jason coming not just once but twice in 2 ships with his brave band of sailors or fishermen. Now, although he brought back an unaccountable amount of pilgrims, equated to the sands of the sea and the stars of the heaven, as was promised by the ever-living to Abraham, that his offspring would become a multitudinous race that was to be beyond accounting. It would he multiplied the stars many times and told you still didn't have the figure. And he talked about the sands of the sea, could not even count his offspring or his children. We find that there were astronomer priests who knew by the great astronomical alignment or the configuration of the stars that the Messiah of Israel was to be born. But the religious world has lost, it appears, all knowledge of astronomy as related to the Bible centuries ago. But Bullinger, who lived nearly a century ago, he gives us clues and great proof of the correlation between the Bibles and the stars and the secrets that they hold. And is it not time that this generation could possibly you be the ones that would unlock and hear and understand these things? Now we find Bullinger's book, The Witness of the Stars. It was first appeared in August 31, 1893, and it was reprinted until the mid-50s. Now, as we read from a different angle of the great truths of coming and going to heaven and the judgment to be rendered, as it speaks of, upon the wicked nations and individuals, which is about to become, my friends, a reality in our time. Now, for centuries, men have talked about the end times, or what they allude to as the Battle of Armageddon. Do the stars speak of the final judgment of the evil nation? Now, he has one, he refers to Ara, the altar. As we've explained what the altar is, that it refers to the house of the Almighty. It refers to his home, and men have misunderstood it, thinking that it was something different. But it goes on, and in Bullinger he speaks of a consuming fire prepared for his enemies. Here we have an altar, a burning fire, that is placed significantly and ominously upside down, with this fire burning and pointing towards the lower region, as the men of old, they call this earth Tartarus, or the abyss, or outer darkness. Tarius is the ancient name for earth. Now, it is an astrum with 9 stars, of which 3 are of the 3rd magnitude, 4 of the 4th, and so forth. It is south of the scorpion's tail, and when these constellations were first formed, it was visible only to the very lowest horizon of the south, pointing to the completion of all judgment in a lake of fire. Now we find in the zodiac of Dendra, we have a different picture, giving us another aspect of the same judgment. It is a man enthroned with a flail or a whip in his hand. Now we might remember that Christ in the book of Revelation, he said he was coming to rule with a rod of iron, meaning that he was going to see to it that law was returned, and he would enforce them. Now when we go back to this man is enthroned with this whip or rod in his hand, his name was called Ba, B-A-U, the same name as Hercules, and which means he cometh. It is from the Hebrew B-O-H, meaning to come, as in is spoken of in Isaiah. Who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah? And the lake of fire, the final conflict of the nations involved in atomic or hydrogen warfare, the judgment brought on by ourselves. Now the lake here, it represents an area of space instead of the sea of space. The fire is fired from space. Now we know that this generation, they understand the term astronauts and the function and the ability to wander through space. When the Greeks referred to a ship that could travel through the great sea of space, they referred to them as the ship of Argo, meaning those who flew as Argonauts, as per Bullinger's writing of nearly a century ago, who spoke of the Argonauts of Homer. Again, he speaks of the ships Argo, the ship, the Pilgrim, safe at home. And all through the religious world, Christendom, they talk about the mighty Jesus coming back to redeem his pilgrims and take them safely home. This is the celebrated ship of the Argonauts, which Homer sang nearly 10 centuries before Christ. Sir Isaac Newton puts the expedition of the Argonauts shortly after the death of Solomon, about 975 BC, while Dr. Blair's chronology puts it at 1236 BC. So we find that these ancient men of old, they did not believe this was a fable, but it was a very real occurrence. Whatever fables have gathered around the stories, there can be no doubt as to its great antiquity. Some think that the story had its origin in the name as well as in the fact from the Ark of Noah and its mysterious journey. All this is clear when divested of mythic details, and that the sailors in the ship, after all their dangers and toils and the battle was over, they came back victorious to their own shores. The golden fleece, for which the Argonauts went in search, tells of a treasure that had been lost. Jason, the great captain, he tells of him who recovered it from the serpent, which guarded it with ever watchful eye when none else was able to approach it. Thus, through the fables and the myths of the Greeks, we can see the light primeval shine in this light once again seen. Lights of this sign and its constellations, so that their teachings cannot be misunderstood. Now, for example, Matthew 13:44 gives a parable of a treasure hid in a field. As Christ told us, it meant the world, and the man sells all that he has to go and buy it. The writer of centuries ago made a particular statement that I'd overlooked when first reading this old book of 20 years ago. But after 3 decades of research, some very strange things started to fall in place were opened up for me. And I opened a can of worms that only could be proved by putting all of this together. One cannot wonder what was this author of a century ago was thinking when he connected Homer's celebrated ships of the Argonauts who were to return to this earth with this statement, the Ark of Noah and its mysterious journey. We're going to get into that later. Boy, I've had some of my dearest friends that I esteem, and I think that they're great biblical scholars and that they have an open mind. But boy, when I start to tell them that the account of the Genesis flood is the Babylonian account, it is not the correct one. It has been slipped into our scriptures. Oh boy, they get all bent out of shape because they have a mindset. They've been programmed their whole lives on this, just like I was. But my friends, I had to go back and take another look at it. And I think later on, if you keep an open mind, and if you don't believe me, my friends, you should at least hear it out, so you will know where I make my mistakes, and you'll be able to combat me. Now remember Homer's song. He sang of an ark or a ship that was coming to take the star sons back to their homes in outer space. The ark knowing the flood as it was presented by the religious world and the men of science, well-meaning, God-fearing men, I'm sure, many cases trying to prove their story to justify that the Bible and their belief in God is well taken, but it's full of errors and nothing more than a myth that's been handed down by the priestcraft and the Jim Bakers and others who would use some of these sorry translations, saying on God's behalf this is the accepted Bible. God does not make mistakes or err. And all of these translations are full of error. The story of Noah in reality is a saga that most of the religious world will never understand or believe unless they open their mind to this new evidence. It was actually a great extraterrestrial ship that brought the remnants of men to this earth after a great interplanetary confrontation, of which the so-called flood was only a very small segment. Again, we have the ancient Greek bard here, Homer, singing of extraterrestrial ships coming for the pilgrims who were stranded on the earth to take them back to the seat of government, to their place in outer space, and to be distributed to the different mansions of space and to become the rulers of other planets after they graduate from their schoolhouse. If this is important to you, then you better consider these, my friends. Can you contemplate the possibilities? As we read Arrhenius, Homer, and others, and they say they did not have the great insight to the fact that modern man has failed so miserably to understand. Arrhenius sang of Argo, stern foremost hauled, no mark of onward speeding ship. Sternward she comes as vessels do when sailors turn the helm. Or entering harbor all the oars backwater, and gliding backward to an anchor comes. It tells of the blessing homecoming when the ransom of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with songs. And everlasting joy upon their heads they shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. As we go back to, it sounds like, what is he doing? He's singing right here from Isaiah 34:10. It tells of the glorious Jason, of whom it is asked, Art thou not it which hath cut Rahab, who wounded the dragon? Art thou not it which hath dried the sea, the waters of the great deep? See, referring to the time of Moses. Continuing now, thou hast made the depth of the sea a way for the ransom to pass over. Therefore the redeemed of the Lord shall return, and will come with singing unto Zion, and etc. Isaiah, the 2nd chapter, 9-11. Now the Greco-Judean equivalent of Joshua or Jesus Zion is the mighty seat of the government in outer space, the third heaven, Sinai, New Jerusalem, loose, house of God, the altar. Now let us go to the astronomical alignment of the planets that make up what they call Cancer. For the Lord hath redeemed Jacob, and hath ransomed him from the hand that was stronger than thee. Therefore shall come and sing in the height of Zion. The height, something up high. And shall flow together. In other words, fly to it. To the goodness of the Lord. Jeremiah 31, 11 and 12. Note the height of Zion, high up in outer space, like John of Revelation visited and others. This is the return of the great emigrant ship Argo with all of his company of travelers. For this is the meaning of the word Argo. In Grichner's Egyptian panosphere, Argo is represented by two galleys, as we now have two sheepfolds, which proves are surmounted by ram's heads, and the stern of one of them ends in a fish's tail. One of the two occupies 4 segments of the sphere from Taurus to Virgo, while the other occupies the 4 from Leo to Capricorn. One half of the southern meridian is occupied by these galleys and their construction and decorations. Astronomers tell us that they carry us back. The one to the period when the bull opened the year, to which Virgil refers, and the other in the same epoch when the summer solstice was in Leo, an era greatly antecedent to the Argonautic expedition. How else, they ask, do we account for the one ship having her bow in the first decan of Taurus and her poop in the last decan of Leo? Or for one galley being frightened with the installed bull? Now we've told you how the ancients referred to Venus as the bull, and the other with the celestial lion. These are the words of an astronomer who knew nothing whatsoever of our interpretation of the heavens, which is set forth in his work, and the old author quotes, "The 2 sheepfolds represent extraterrestrial brothers living in different worlds or mansions which the Christ spoke of, the witness of the stars. It will indeed be a large vessel, the true Argo, with his company of travelers, and a great multitude which no man can number." All of this is indicated by the immense size of the constellation, as well as by the large number of its stars. Now there are 64 stars in Argo, that's reckoned by the Britannic Catalogue. 1 of the first magnitude, 6 of the second, 9 of the third, 9 of the fourth, and etc. Only a small part of the ship's poop is visible in Britain, its brightest star. Now A, near the keel, is called Canopus or Canobus, which means the possession of he who cometh, the released who traveled, Shohil, Aramaic. That also the Aramaic describes it as the desired, Subailon, the branch. Is not all of this exactly in harmony with the rest of the sign? Is it not this that is written in the book? Therefore fear thou not, O my servant Jacob, saith the Lord. Neither be dismayed, O Israel, for lo, I will save thee from afar, and thy seed from the land of their captivity. And Jacob shall return and be in rest, and be quiet, and none shall make thee afraid. For I am with thee, saith the Lord, who will save thee. Jeremiah 30 verses 10 and 11. I'm still quoting. This is from Bullinger. This is what they put in nearly 100 years ago, but they did not get or understand the extraterrestrial connection and how this would be accomplished. How could they? But they knew that there were ships that flew. And they go on to quote, "Lift up thine eyes around and see, all they that gather themselves together, they come to thee. Thy sons come from afar." That's outer space, friend. "And thy daughters shall be nursed at thy side, and thou shalt see and flow together." See, flow, in other words, fly, my friends. But they had to wash it down a little. Again, quoting from Bullinger, and thy heart shall fear and be enlarged, because of the abundance of the sea shall be converted unto thee. He's talking about the great sea of unbelieving people, those of the other races and religions and peoples of this world who have cursed you and your God and your religion. We shall see before the show's over, my friends. Who are they that fly as a cloud and as doves to their windows? Remember what we said about the windows of space. Surely the isles shall wait for thee, and the ships of Tarshish first to bring thy sons from afar. Isaiah 60, 4, 5, 8, and 9. The whole chapter of Isaiah 60 should be read if we wish to understand the great teaching of the sign which tells of the Messiah's secured possession, the safe folding of his blood-bought flock, the blessed return of his pilgrims, and their abundant entrance into an everlasting rest. Still quoting from Bullinger, this is a blessed home beyond this land, in other words, this world, this land of woe, where trials never come, nor tears of sorrow flow, where faith is lost in sight, and patient love is crowned, and everlasting light and glory throws around. O joy, all joys beyond, to see the Lamb who died, and count each sacred wound in hands and feet and side, to give to him the praise of ever triumph won, and sing through endless days the great things he hath done. Look up, ye saints of God, ne'er fear to tread below the path your Savior trod. Of daily toil and woe, wait but a little while. In uncomplaining love, his own most gracious smile shall welcome you above. The last verse is to you, extraterrestrials who are living on Earth at this time. And so this will conclude our chapter. We thank you for listening. In case you've borrowed this tape, you don't know our address. Pilgrim ship. Greetings, this is Noah Fredericks. The chapter that we're going to be covering today, that you'll find upon this cassette tape, we entitled it Bush Pilot. Ipso facto, let the facts speak for themselves. That was the advice of one of my closest friends that gave me when I told him of the strangest account of a meeting between an extraterrestrial and his ship, who went for several lengthy stays in outer space, but the average person will never believe the report, and it might take a whole book to try to prove it. My friend answered back, so prove it, and let the chips fall where they may. This conversation took place over 4 years ago, and is now turned into enough material to fill 4 books of about the size of 500 pages. But I have tried to condense it down. We find that the strangest story in recorded history that's been overlooked by men for centuries, and I believe that we can bring out enough facts to prove it. It all started when these men, or this man, he was adopted by a wealthy head of state, and when he was just a baby, he was to grow to middle age, and then we find that he killed a man, he became a fugitive, and he moved to another country. He married and became a lowly shepherd, and it was at this time the story turned into a combination between Twilight Zone and Star Trek. We find that our refugee shepherd here, he was in a very remote mountainous area of the desert looking for new pasture and fresh water. When looking up, he saw a very strange craft hovering overhead, and after it had circled for a time, the pilot of this strange craft, he apparently was looking for a safe spot in which to land, which would not frighten the sheep, and we find that the shepherd, he drew closer to see what this strange alien craft, of the like of which he had never seen, and had fire coming out of the bottom of it. As it descended, it created clouds of smoke and dust, and it threw sand and gravel into the air. We find the shepherd's fear was overcome by his curiosity.
He went closer to see what this strange thing was that burned, yet it was not consumed by the frightful fire and heat in which it discharged. We find the real shocker came when the door of this awesome aircraft opened and a man dressed in a space suit. He called to this country boy by his name. He knew him. He invited him to take an extended trip to a great manned space station a few million miles away. Now, no man had ever gone there before, as far as he knew. Now, you couldn't blame the shepherd for being a bit hesitant, but he entered the craft, when he was informed by the pilot that the headquarters wanted to speak with him. They apparently seemed to have, as the story will unfold, it seemed that they had a television monitor similar to the one in Dr. Spock's ship of the series we've watched on television, and it appeared that this mysterious extraterrestrial on the monitor was very persuasive, and apparently he must have put this shepherd at ease. He also called him by name. He seemed to know all about this Earthman, and for whom it appeared that he had great plans. Now, what would go through your mind if you found out that there was a highly advanced civilization located in outer space which had an eye in the sky and a computer readout on you with details of your life that even the IRS computers are not so advanced? Kind of scary. Well, this extraterrestrial, he spoke to this shepherd apparently in his own language, and he learned on his trips of science and things that would stagger the creator of Star Wars. He saw shuttle launchers that would make Star Wars look like horse and buggy builders. Now the shepherd was informed that he was to be the key man in a soon coming invasion of Earth. This was to be the beginning of several over a period of time and was to change the Earth and its inhabitants. After a couple of trips to outer space, a great ship came back with the shepherd and monitored him and his relations, and he was given blueprints which were designed by extraterrestrial engineers of some very strange equipment that was to be built by this shepherd and his brother. His brother, later on, as we'll see in the story, he was to accompany him on a trip or two, and they were careful, as they were informed to design and build this dangerous piece of equipment exactly according to the plans given to them. They later found out it was probably the world's first atomic reactor. Now, a nosy friend of the shepherd, he was killed when he started to fool around with something he didn't know anything about. And later on, we find that the shepherd, he had some neighbors that stole it, and it killed a lot of them. It also caused them to contract cancer and colon problems, sterility, and boils. This was all caused by inflicting too much radiation on them. Well, it seems they couldn't get this hot box back quick enough, and they paid a very large cash settlement to the shepherd and his friends for stealing it. As time went by, we find that the shepherd and his friends, they had some other neighbors who became very angry with them when they decided they were going to look for a better neighborhood. It was kind of like the Martins and the Coys. Now they didn't want this shepherd and his kinfolk moving out, as they would lose all of their cheap country labor, so to speak. So the extraterrestrial gave him more scientific equipment to even out this feud. There was one weapon in particular which sounded like a laser cannon that took 2 or 3 men to operate it. Now, I hope that I'm not about to lose you with this apparent incredulous story, and I'm sure you want to know just who exactly was this man and where's my proof. And you're probably saying to yourself, why haven't we heard of this before? Now, the shepherd's name, if you haven't guessed, his name was Moses, and Aaron his brother. You say that you've read the Bible, you attended Sunday school, but you never have ever heard anything close to this account. The fact is, you never will understand it if you're using the English so-called translations, which are promoted by the mainline denominations for many reasons. Now, one reason, taken from an ancient poem, in pious times their priestcraft began. It was shortly after Christ left the earth, and that men took over and they organized men into denominations, each denomination claiming that theirs was the only way, putting men in fear of their immortal souls if perchance they should wander outside what they had been taught by whatever version or perversion of the biblical translation. And we find, as it should be, it was not recorded accurately as it went through English, French, and German. And they were forced to believe and were given threats of purgatory and hell, and if you don't turn, you're going to burn. And they frightened them with the fact that they would not enter into the resurrection unless they were to follow every jot and tittle of that denomination. Now, you say this sounds weird, as later on we're going to prove that when Christ took the disciples with him, and without arguing the point, this mysterious mount that men have thought was a mountain, where Christ took them, this thing that was called a Mount of Transfiguration. It's a very mysterious thing that we'll find, and there Christ introduced Elijah and Moses to his disciples. Well, jumping ahead in the story, we realize that these men apparently had not learned very much by this. They wanted Elijah and Moses and Christ. They wanted them to come down. They were going to build each one of them a temple or a tabernacle. And Christ said, "The heavens are my home and the earth is merely my footstool, and who are you that you're going to build me a house?" Well, right away they wanted to start 3 religions there. Wouldn't that have created some real chaos? Well, anyway, we find that things went from bad to worse in the first 200 or 300 years after Christ. Then they went into the dark ages of superstition and ignorance and burning people at the stake. Now, the reason that we seem to deviate from our story, if you will only bear with me, for those that are unlearned in these matters, are uninitiated, or have not even any religious background, we feel that it is most important to fill in some background. So, let's say the atheist, the doubting Thomas, those that have never picked up a book, or those that were intimidated by it, we're trying to give you some background to make it simple and to see why and how man has looked or overlooked these apparent outrageous claims which we are making at this time. As you find that there are hundreds of books that are available where both preacher and student can look up every word in the Bible. These books, they will take you back through the Greek, the Hebrew, the Chaldean, and many other languages we find that the Bible has been translated from. And in many cases, pardon me, looking up the original meaning of the word or words, as the case may be, we will be giving countless examples and reasons of why and how we can prove our case. One of the main ones, as I will say throughout many of these tapes, I would advise you to get a Strong's Concordance. I think that after examining most all of them on the market, it is the very best. And if you can handle that as you get further along, you may want to go get a lexicon of the Hebrew and the Greek and the Chaldean and so forth, and check these words out for yourself, and you'll see where these translators back through the ages, and especially in the dark ages, they had multiple choice there. They would look up these words that had many different meanings to them, but they interpreted them wrong because they were so earthly minded they couldn't contemplate things coming from outer space. They had a mindset which excluded any type of airships. Now, as to why the sugarcoating of religion has hid the true science of air travel and these awesome inventions such as computers, televisions, radios, fighter ships, and etc., we find that the sugarcoating made nil most all of the real accounts that are hidden in the pages of this collection of books that we call the Bible and many other ancient manuscripts, along with their extraterrestrial connection encounters, also with the help and the hindrance from the would-be gods and devils, as they are referred to by the religious world, who came from outer space. Now, how did this confusion to come about? to give you a little background to help you get a clearer picture of the problems that continued through the centuries, compounding error upon error, and we find in the British and the German, they were faced with a dilemma when they desired to translate their Bible into their native tongue. They couldn't find anybody who was really familiar with the ancient Hebrew, which, like Latin, had been considered a dead language for centuries. A lot of people are not aware that the ancient Hebrew, in which most of the Old Testament was written, it had been outdated 400 years BC. And so, to cut them a little slack, we can see what the translators were up against. Also, there were words mixed with Hebrew from even more ancient languages and unknown and unused roots, as Strong's Concordance tells us. Add to these problems the translators, they feared for their life, because if a word or a sentence were mistranslated right or wrong, they found that it offended the king or the church. It could bring about a trial of heresy or blasphemy, causing this poor scribe or translator to die, in many cases, slow and agonizing death. We also find that there's a problem with the idioms and the language. One problem with the idioms that's referring to archaic terminology of the language, which they had not used for centuries, and thus could cause a radical change, a meaning, and confuse a present-day reader, as well as having confused the old translators. As we look to Webster's explanation of an idiom, he says, quote, "Idiom, the language peculiar to a people, a tongue, or to a district, community, a class, a dialect. The structural form peculiar to any language, an expression of the usage of a language. This is peculiar to itself, whether in grammatical construction or in having a meaning which cannot be derived as a whole from the conjoined meaning of its elements. A form of expression characteristic of an author." So here we have the translators trying to not only learn an ancient language as they go along, you might say on the job training, one might say trying to comprehend as well as the etymology. Now, Webster's definition of etymology reads thus: "The origin or derivation of a word as shown by its analysis into elements, by pointing out the root or the primitive upon which it is based, or by referring it to an earlier form in its present language." Now, the accounts setting for such origin or derivation, the branch of philology concerned with etymology. Now, as a point of reference, the Bible comes down to us through many languages. So words, they've lost their true meanings, and the translations also come to us from the Hebrew and the Greek, not to mention the Israelites picked up a lot of words from their captors in Egypt and Babylon, and they picked up words of the ancient Akkadians. And so in tracing out the etymology of the language, one comes up with a picture that makes more sense. For example, English people who come to America or from other countries invariably remark that English is the hardest language to learn. Now, bank seems to be a simple word, but try explaining its various meanings to a foreigner. There are many examples. I go to the bank to deposit money. The aviator will bank his plane to make a turn. The river is eroding its bank. In the evening, I go to the basement to bank the fire. And what we have is a wealth of information that has been lost till now. So let us unravel some of this lost technology. We might find also, let me give you another quick example, how Christendom has lost a lot of people because they left the church, because they couldn't go along with the denominational interpretation like we find in the New Testament, where Christ is talking with Peter, vice versa, and he's saying, "Lord, how am I going to pay my taxes?" And he tells him to go down to the bank and fish, and in the fish's mouth he'll find a gold coin and he can pay his taxes. Well, what this does, This puts Christ into the realm of a magician. This gets into the esoteric and in the realm of magic, making Christ a type of Mandrake the magician. No wonder the intelligents ignore the Bible. But when we understand the idiom of that day and the etymology of that day, and we can understand something like this, that was an old expression. In other words, Christ was saying to the man, go fishing, catch the fish, and go sell them, and then you'll have the gold to pay your taxes. So this was just an expression like we might tell a foreigner, my friend's in a real pickle. And he'll think, well, maybe the guy fell into a pickle jar or a pickle barrel or something. It does not compute because he doesn't have that idiom of expression in his language. And it's like in the very ancient of days, they talk about finding the coin between the hooves or the toes of a cow or a bullock. And so, in other words, they were saying, on the hoof, this bull is worth $40. And so, see, it's just an old idiom, an old term of expression that has been lost to modern man, as we have not taken the time, or our preachers haven't, or teachers, to go look this up, and even us who claim to be students of the Bible. So we find a large part of the Bible is a book of knowledge that was brought here. People fail to understand this when I say the Bible is a book of knowledge brought from outer space. What do? They get upset. They get mental indigestion. And I say, wait a minute. You believe in angels, don't you? Oh, yes, I do, brother. I said, are angels from this world? No, they come from heaven. And I said, well, may I translate heaven as outer space? Somewhere out there? But even the religious that are always talking about coming from heaven, they have, most of them, as I understand them, have a concept of some fourth or fifth dimension, some ethereal spook dimension where nothing is real. It's like a dream world. And then these creatures come flapping out on chicken wings and materialize to us. This is what has confused us. Well, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that because I think we cleared up in a lot of our other chapters. But how shall we use the book if we fail to understand it? Let's start with an obscure, overlooked, misunderstood chapter in the Bible. This is what has driven away the intelligence, those who have the ability to reason, who do not buy somebody's interpretation he probably couldn't explain of just take it on faith, brother. If I took everything on faith, if I picked up a Book of Mormon or the Book of the Baptist, whichever book I picked up first, I would have faith to believe that, as all of them try to tell me to. But then what happens when I pick up somebody else's book and it reads different? Do I lose my faith, or do I go search it out and see where the mistakes come in? Well, without wondering, let's go to this chapter that they have not understand. You find in Exodus 3rd chapter 1-6, which relates the story of Moses meeting an angel in the burning bush in the desert. This is one of the great keys to unlock the whole rest of this book, which still remains shrouded in mystery to the religious world and ignored in part, I would say mostly ignored by the scientific world as nothing more than religious myth, a superstitious fairy tale. No one can blame anybody for rejecting the story of an angel who appears in a burning bush talking with Moses, as we find that a lot of people's thinking their whole religion is based on Cecil B. DeMille's movies. They figure, well, hey, I don't have to read the book, I saw the movie. And they sit on the edge of their seats and they watch some 80-year-old man in a bathrobes and sandals, and he's climbing some dark, wet, slimy mountain with thunder and lightning added in for good measure and rocks bouncing off the cliff. And now that would scare even the bravest of soul. Then we see Moses. He comes back down the mountain with what appears to be like the equivalent, well, as a little boy, they resemble to me two giant tombstones, one under each arm, and on them are inscribed the laws. Now, not only did old Cecil B. DeMille, he missed a great scene for his movie, but the religious world has never gone into the connection between the angel, the so-called bush, and the so-called mountain. Now the question is, where did Moses go, and what was the size of this ship that I maintain that he went in? Does the Bible give us a description of one? Yes, I've got to clear this up. I am going to prove, if you're of average intelligence and have reason and you don't have a closed mind, and if you have religious toes, allow me to step on them for a little while. I had to step on my own. But what we're maintaining here, as it's mistranslated, this burning bush, and this angel that Moses met in this bush, they went somewhere. Where did they go? Well, what was the size of this ship? I think, as we will find out later on, as we will prove in many other chapters, we can't cover it all in one. We're going to prove that Moses was picked up in a very small, what I will call a shuttle ship. And I think the chapter itself will prove that, because later on we would start doubting this story of Moses climbing some slick, slimy old mountain to meet some spooky god in the middle of a thunderstorm on the top of it. That does not compute. Later on, we're going to find out where it said he was picked up. The Almighty says, remember when I brought you safely to myself as in an eagle ship. Well, it doesn't take any kind of a ship or a magic eagle to fly something to the top of the mountain. So consequently, we've misunderstood mountain, and we've misunderstood where the Almighty is. He's not hanging around out there in the Sinai desert, because we find that by Christ himself, he said, heaven is the Almighty's home. Christ claimed it was his home. He said the earth's merely a footstool, one of the old idioms where he sits down onto this planet periodically. And who in all of Christendom or the religious world knows anything about the New Testament would deny the fact that he said that he would be back? So we're going to have to examine and find out some of these ships. So later on it would appear that I'm wrong in my concept when I prove that he took off in a ship here, because we'll find that there's many different types of ships. Some that were called eagle ships. Some were called Sus, which was an iron ship, according to the Hebrew and the ancient Chaldean. And so the translators, they translated it horse. But then they got themselves in a tight, which we cover in other chapters, where they talk about, where the Almighty says, my horses are swifter than eagles. And so when we find out that horses is erroneous, that was put in there by the first translators of the Old Testament, the Greeks. This is where we get Pegasus from the Greeks, the flying horse stuff. Well, anyway, let's go back now. Let's see, does the Bible give us a description of one of these ships? Yes, and how long did it take for Moses to reach this destination? 40 days, as we're going to prove in the ensuing chapters. Let us present the true story of what really went on between Moses and the extraterrestrial messengers and his encounter in the desert. Now, we're not the first generation to be disturbed by this enigma. As we go back and we look at the great poet Emerson, who wrote of death, when he said something that never really made sense to me, but when I was a boy they still used to quote Emerson at funerals. When man in the bush with God shall meet. It appears that he either knew and understood, or he was greatly puzzled as he pondered the mysteries of the bush and God, man, angels, and immortality. Now Moses, who was a fugitive from Egypt, he was fleeing from the wrath of Pharaoh when he met Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian. Now Moses, he took her for a wife, and he started watching over his father-in-law's sheep, And then one day it tells us when he was on the far side of the desert, Moses was astonished to see a small spacecraft land. Its occupant or pilot, he spoke to Moses, telling him that a great extraterrestrial lord, now remember, he was some great lord in outer space. And I'm not sure, I think that, that Moses referred to him as Ra. Now, a lot of people will dispute this, but remember, he was raised in the house of Pharaoh himself by Pharaoh's daughter, and they referred to the God of all the gods. They knew that there was one true God, but they also spoke of other great gods or lesser gods, and they referred to him as Ra, the sun god. And I believe that in ensuing chapters I can prove up that they were prove that they were not so ignorant that they worshiped the sun as God, but due to modern days man's failure to go back and research the ancient records, as I have made a great deal effort in trying to do and straighten out this mystery. I find that the Babylonians, and we find the Egyptians and even Indians of Central and South America, many times throughout ancient history, they referred to Venus as the sun, and they tell in the ancient days of antiquity, when Venus moved into such close proximity with our planet, that it was even brighter than the sun. But he has this mindset that they must be worshiping this great sun in our galaxy, that we find our planet and others are rotating about using the force of gravity and energy from the sun. But anyway, going back to Moses, when he's telling him of this great extraterrestrial lord that wishes to meet with Moses, now we find, according to the James Moffat Bible, this chapter, according to James Moffat, who spent over 50 years of his life going back to older translations and tried with all of his heart and soul to reconstruct the Bible and to alleviate a lot of the errors. And we find that he said that this chapter, speaking of Moses in Exodus, this chapter is not in proper chronological order, and it also, the translators rearrange sentences and verses. Now we use another man from England, I believe one of their last translations that's since been retranslated, one of the finest Bibles that I have ever used, called the Friar Fenton. He translates Exodus 3, 1-6. Fenton in his footnote says Moses was a stranger there, the place to which the extraterrestrial took him. And so apparently even he, back before the advent of airplanes and the science that we understand, he knew that Moses was taken somewhere. He didn't climb a slick, slimy mountain, but they can't put the burning bush and the mountain of God and Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. So see, there's a great gap there in the chronological order, and this is why man has missed it all of these centuries. Now, we notice that before Moses left on his trip to outer space, in verse 4, the messenger who came to him in a smaller ship, it appears that he was in radio communication with the great mount ship. The messenger, he apparently received orders to bring Moses to the mount. Now, first Moses was talking to an angel or a messenger, and then the Almighty wanted to talk to him, and the translators ran it all together out of sequence because they really didn't know what was going on. Then it goes on to say, then Moses said, I will draw near and examine this great wonder, why this bush is not burned up. But the Lord saw that he approached to examine it, so God called to him from the midst of Sinai and said, Moses, Moses, and he answered, I am here. Stop and think for just a moment. See, the whole problem is, all of this time, for centuries, by our deceiving ourselves, or by the preachers and the teachers, we have assumed that the people of the ancient times, they were primitive. All right, now, Moses was raised by a people outside of his race. Although he probably had access to the great libraries of the pharaohs of Egypt, and he had learned from their history, but it was a slanted history from their culture. There was different views going on here. And so he was confused and realized, a lot of people be horrified because I said Moses for a time called the Eternal, the Almighty, the Heavenly Father, called him Ra. Well, why shouldn't he if he was raised by these extraterrestrials? Because we find later on that Moses apparently confessed that he wasn't sure of the name of God. And it appears that the children of Israel did not know the name of their Heavenly Father, Yahweh. And we find that it was revealed to Moses. And later on we'll show where he said, "This honor I give to you, that you may know my name." But, stepping aside from Moses, there was intervention, as we see, and we will prove through other chapters, that even before Moses, when the men of old had become despondent and had descended into ignorance and lack of knowledge, and forgot the things that took place in most ancient history, it was reintroduced to them from extraterrestrial messengers who came in ships. And listen, for those of you that may be doubting this and have mental indigestion, you just hang on. We're going to show you all through this book. And those that would deny it, I would say you haven't read it. Now, let's stop and examine this, what I just read a little while ago, where Moses drew near to see what this great wonder was, that the bush wasn't burned up. And it talks about, it says, "But the Lord saw he approached to examine it. So God called to him from the midst of Sinai, said, 'Moses, Moses,' and he answered, 'I am here.'" Now, first of all, I mean, when I was a little kid, this really upset me. I went to church, and they told me, here's a burning bush, and it's got an angel standing in the middle of it, and here Moses out here herding his sheep, or his father-in-law's sheep anyway, and then suddenly God starts to talk to him. So I pictured in my mind, here's an angel, and here's God standing there, and this bush is burning up, but it doesn't consume itself, and I got mental indigestion as I grew older. I said, well, I equated it to St. Elmo's fire. I tried to find some excuse for God, but there was nothing wrong with God, and there was nothing wrong with the account of the messengers and all, but all along we're going to prove that it was the translators, that they were confused. They had no scientific knowledge. Now, if they had been living in an age, if they had had all about them, video cassette recorders, if they had televisions, and they saw the computers in the airports, and they saw all of the different scientific evidence that we have, so that we could change our mindset, we could equate it to something that makes sense. Now, notice here, it says, "And the Lord saw him approach." Now, I think, and I believe that we can prove conclusively, the Lord, as we show here, a lot of times where they talk about Jehovah, it talks about the noble ones. The Lord here is the captain of this small shuttle ship, as we're going to prove. It saw that he approached him, and apparently, a lot has been left out of the account here. He apparently opened up the doors, and he went inside of this. And then it said that God called to him. Well, this Almighty, this ever-living, this Father of Heaven, called to him, because I'm sure by this time that Moses was frightened. He was probably in a state of dumb shock, and he said, "I don't know who this guy is, but he knows all about me." And as we're going to learn later on, it doesn't seem to give it in this account, but later on we find such a great preponderance of evidence that this extraterrestrial captain of this small shuttle ship, he was trying to talk Moses into going with him. And I believe that he had a form of electronic, sophisticated equipment inside of this ship. And we quote Ecclesiasticus, there's nothing new under the sun, no, not one. Whatever man invents, the men of old invented it, and they already forgot about it. And so I think when we find out God is the great creator, he's this heavenly Father, this almighty, this mysterious God that even Christendom fails to understand. They try to see him through the Christ who became mortal here on this planet like us. But they fail to understand that he is scientific, and that these messengers, as we're going to learn in other chapters, that they, that the messengers that came to Abraham, they came to Jacob, they came to Gideon, they came to John of the New Testament, they came to Lot and his family in Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember, they went in, they stayed overnight, they slept with them, they ate with them, and all these men, different men in these accounts, they talk about cooking supper for these men. They sit down, they ate with them, they slept with them, they stayed with them. And as we must repeat, in case you haven't got to that chapter, that even Ezekiel, he was told by this extraterrestrial messenger that the Greeks translated angel, he said, Ezekiel, don't bow down to me. I am a man like yourself. I am of your brethren. I am of your household. And this gives us mental indigestion when we understand that they're saying, look, I'm your space brother. Why or how else? And stop and think, when God promised, wasn't it Abraham? I may be wrong here, and so you can write me a letter and make fun of me over it. I may be wrong, but the Almighty, when he promised Abraham that his seed, his offspring, his descendants, his children, that would become the great nations of the earth and the great kings of the earth, and he said, you'll become like the sands of the seas and like the stars of the heaven, that nobody will even be able to count all of you. So obviously there were some men being bred here on this earth to populate other worlds, and this world could not contain this promised progeny, this star seed that was spoke to these men. Now remember, they were called pilgrims, they were called aliens. David said it, Abraham said it, Jacob said it. All these different men, they recognized that they had been brought here, they had been dumped off in some great days of antiquity, that they were strangers and pilgrims, and they longed to go back to a heavenly Jerusalem. It's all right there in the Bible, it's all right there in Christendom, but Christendom and the religious world has failed to put it all together. And this is what we're doing, and this is why, at times, for those that don't have a background, that it seems that I wander off. So let us go back, let's try something new. Let's examine it from an advanced scientific point of view that the religious world has failed to consider. It's time, my dear friends, for us to come out of the dark ages and put this darkness off of their mind. And like Christ used the word in the Greek, as it was translated metanoia over and over. Many times it was translated salvation, and I believe part of your salvation can be equated to metanoia, meaning change your mind. Change your mind. He said that all through the Bible. Get your concordance out. You look up mysteries. Behold, I show you a mystery. If we will only study and learn and comprehend, he will help us and show us quite clearly that we can put aside these mysteries, and there will be no more mysteries, and we won't be like Paul, who said, I look through a glass darkly. But we can start to see, as we clean this glass off of ignorance and darkness and the enigmatic confusion of the people of the dark ages and back in antiquity, and we can go beyond that to an understand when those men who wrote this had light and understanding and had been shown science beyond even our present day comprehension, but they had such a mindset, as Mr. Brown told you in tape number 1, that they had no knowledge of some of the sophisticated math and science and computer chips and things like that. They had nothing to equate it to. So they had to use primitive analogies. But now is the time for us to, like Isaiah, 61, arise and shine, for your light has come. So now then, let's assume here that Moses stepped into this, what I maintain, as a small shuttle craft. That is to take him to a larger craft, parked somewhere in upper space, possibly, and I believe too large to land here on this planet, and why use all that fuel and energy? So they sent a shuttlecraft down to him. We're going to prove this in a little bit, so bear with us. And as they get into this larger ship, then they take off because it's faster and it's larger, and it goes to where this Almighty is, the translators put in. Then God called him. Called to him on what? If the Almighty, and it appears he's in somewhere outer space, if he could scream all the way down to earth to Moses without busting his eardrums and causing earthquakes from the vibrations, why did he waste his time sending this angel to him? So as we look at it from a modern standpoint, we would visualize Moses standing inside of this small shuttlecraft, and I would say that they probably had something just as sophisticated as all of these shows that we have on TV of the Star Trekkies and Star movies. That he walked in, he saw this great video screen there, and he had a voice coming out of the speakers and said, Moses, that God called to Moses. And so we understand the Lord here in this case, he was just the Lord of the ship, or in our modern days, he was the captain of this shuttlecraft. So apparently the Lord of the ship said on his radio that he had located Moses. And then this great extraterrestrial, they called God here, he talked to his pilot and to Moses as he communicated with him from inside of what I'm going to prove is the Sinai space station, as one of the analogies. As we're going to find throughout the chapters of this book, it was changed many times all through the centuries. Everybody come up with a new name. It was called a rock. It was called a house, it was called a tree house, it was called a temple, it was called a tabernacle, it was called a new heaven and a new earth by John, it was called a holy city, it was called Mount Zion. And so bear with me, it all seems confusing then when they tried to translate the passage, which told of a very large ship that came from Sinai space station, as we're going to call it here in a minute. They in turn called it Sinai. As we read Exodus 19, chapter 11 to 12, we're jumping ahead about 4 decades here to prove our point. And it goes like this. I'll just quote from the King James. And be ready against the third day, for the third day the Lord, this doesn't mean the eternal, the Almighty. It's probably one of his great lords of space like Michael or Gabriel, and some of those are even lesser ones under him, will come down in the sight of the people. Now, the translators put upon, but the word was in Mount Sinai. And thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying, take heed to yourself that you go not up into the mount, or touch the border, meaning the edges of it. Whoever touches the mount shall be surely put to death. Then verse 11, it tells of this awesome ship landing. The Farrar Fenton translation tells them not to touch the skirts of it. You ever see a mountain with skirts or many skirts? No, it's talking about like the flaps on our modern aircraft. Now, verse 12, it tells us it wasn't safe for the people to get close to it. Why? Then he tells Moses not to let the people go up into this great mount ship. So why did the Almighty send the messenger or the angel to get Moses, then scream to Moses to come hither from some lofty mountaintop? Note, it says that he called to Moses from the midst of Sinai. I would like to give you a couple of different renditions here, one from the Friar Fenton and one from James Moffat, and allow me to read their account. Now, as I told you earlier, that well, my dear friends, before I get on to pontificating about all this, as I'm rather excited about it, we would ask you at this time to please. Now, before I continue to show you some very interesting and different things out of the James Moffat and the Friar Fenton Bible concerning this meeting with the burning bush, allow me to go back for just a minute to show you and equate this captain of the ship here, as I believe he was a type of military man in a military craft who was to pick up Moses. We go back when the Hebrews were about to cross the Red Sea, and the angel of God, he directed the movements of the great pillar of the cloud, as we have shown in other chapters how they turned it. They were able to look out of the windows of it and all, but that's another account in another chapter. But we show that this angel of God, as I say, he was directing the movements of this thing that was called a pillar of cloud, so that it hid them from the pursuing Egyptians. We find that the guiding angel here sent on this occasion here, he probably belonged to the military personnel of the spacecraft, like the technical advisor who was sent to Joshua before the taking of Jericho. That's another wonderful story, and we have really not got the whole truth of what unfolded there, but that's another chapter. So we find that when Joshua, he came near Jericho, it said he looked up, and he saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up, notice this, Joshua went up to meet him and said, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And the man said to him, "I am here as the captain of the armies of the Lord." And as you find in checking the ancient Hebrew, you find that he was telling him he was the captain of the armies of the Yahweh, the God of the children of Adam. And so you'll find this account in Joshua, the 5th chapter, 5:13 to 14. And we put this in to give you a better idea of what type of man that we find Moses is dealing with here. Now, if you are able to get a hold of one of the older books of James Moffat, I would suggest that you do, because he gives irrefutable evidence throughout his translations. You find when you go to Exodus in his book, he puts chapter 4 before 2, or it follows in this order, chapter 4, 2, and then 3. Now, even though he tried to straighten that out, he did not realize, apparently, that the translators, not knowing that this was a vehicle that met Moses, that they erroneously translated burning bush, then they did not, or were not able to follow the sequence here. That we'll find that Moses steps into the ship, they take off, they go on a journey, and then they come to this great Mount of Sinai. And so we will try to straighten out this mistranslation and show you that there is something wrong, because he already, years and years, decades ago, he realized that it was even in the wrong chronological order, but he missed the point that even the paragraphs had been rearranged, so the superstitious, ignorant translator who lacked the science background to understand this. He had to put it into something that made sense to him, and he had to keep it all here on the ground and work out a pretty little story here that's confused us for centuries. So now, starting verse 1 of the 3rd chapter from Moffat. One day, as Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, he led to the flock to the western side of the prairie, and he reached the sacred hill of Horeb. Now, my dear friends, as we're going to show conclusively, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that there has been mistranslations here, and the translators were not able to realize that Horeb and Sinai were one and the same, and we show you even the New Testament, they bring it out, and they fail to understand that notice here it said the sacred hill. Now, is there any preacher out there who would tell you that there is a sacred hill or mountain or mount here on this earth? And would they tell you that that's where the Almighty is? He's hanging out on a sacred hill. No, of course not. They wouldn't do that. And it would be blasphemy to go back, as we will show in Gideon, who the extraterrestrials intervened on his behalf several times, and then after they were overcoming vast armies of their enemies, so old Gideon, he thought, well, I'll be a good old boy, and I will give the Almighty the silver star, so to speak. So he took all of the gold from the earrings of the enemies who they had slain, and they took the gold chains from around the neck of the camels. And Moses asked all the brave soldiers, give them to me, and I'm going to melt them down, and I'm going to make an ephod, so we can remember what Yahweh did for us. So later on they started worshiping this edifice, this fetish symbol, and then the Almighty was forgotten and they turned into a bunch of idol worshippers. But note, the western side of the prairie, they reached the sacred hill of Horeb. Nonsense. That's out of order. The angel of the Eternal appeared to him in a flame of fire. All right, now we go back. We hear the accounts of Elijah. Some say he was taken up in a whirlwind and a fiery chariot. So now we can make sense of this. The angel of the Eternal appeared to him in a flame of fire. Then we read Zechariah's account where he looked up and he saw the great mountains of brass that were in clouds that was unfolding around them, a great turmoil. And it talks about the thunder and the lightning and the fire coming out. And then he talked about doors opening up in these mountains of brass or iron, depending on which translation. And then it talked about fiery chariots came out of them. And then it tells us that then out of the chariots there came horses, which were mistranslation of the word Sus, iron ships, as we prove through the ancient Hebrew. So there was, like Ezekiel said, wheels within wheels within wheels. Shuttle ships inside of great exploring ships, inside of something that was so big, the mothership, so to speak, that's eluded us because of its size and its proportion. So the angel appeared to him in a flame of fire rising out of, then he puts in thorn bush. When he looked, there was a thorn bush aflame, ablaze with fire, yet it was not consumed. As we go on, we're going to find out that bush was a mistranslation of a ship. And we find where they talk about the plains of Shinar. We find out Farrar Fenton, he didn't get the picture, but he translated it correctly when he said, for Shinar, he said it meant bushland. And we find out that Christendom has failed to understand the trees in the garden. They were speaking of planets. using the old idiom of trees. And we will tell you over and over again, we'll show the point where the Chinese, they said that they were the wood from the trees of heaven, equating planets to trees in the ancient idioms and the ancient allegories here. So what we have here, he said that he saw this fiery ship of fire coming out of it, and he couldn't understand why it wasn't burned up. But did he understand by its emblem, or did it have an emblem of a tree like the one that Gideon, as we're going to learn later on, he came in contact with a ship that seemed to have two different emblems on it. One time he referred to it as a tree. It must have had an emblem on it. Was it from this bush land? Now a bush is smaller than a tree. Was it talking about a great satellite space station? We're going to prove all this as we go down the road. And then Moses goes on and says, I will step aside, said Moses, and see this marvel, why this thorn bush is not yet burned up. Then the Eternal saw that he stepped aside to look at it. Now, it was not the Eternal. It was one of the lords, one of these captains like we just quoted you from, talking about the days of Joshua. And then they have in parentheses, God called to him out of, or the inside of this thing that they erroneously called a thorn bush, saying, Moses, Moses, and he answered, here I am. And you know, I always get a picture of like an Englishman. They say, I say, John here, when they answer a phone. And he said, do not come close, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is sacred ground. Now, is there any ground on this earth that is sacred? Now the word translated ground there was planet, from the Hebrew word eretz. And sacred, well, a lot of times Christendom uses the word holy and uses the word spirit and spiritual, and they have not the foggiest idea. But this place, it was said it was a sacred planet, a sacred world. Why was it sacred? Because we will find Moses, as we will show in other chapters, another one that will follow sometime in the near future here called A Visit to Mount Sinai, and another one called the Cherubs of Lucifer. Now Lucifer's not talking about the devil or Satan. It's another name for a planet. It means a planet of life. And cherubs is the original word of the Hebrews for cherubims. It's another type or another word used for extraterrestrial ships that came from this planet. Then he said to this Moses, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses covered his face, and he was afraid to look at God. And the Eternal said, I have seen the distress of my people in Egypt, and I've heard them wailing under the slave drivers, for I know their sorrows, and I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and bring them out of the land to a fine and large land abounding in milk and honey. Now, what we're going to find, as we will prove in other chapters here, and I've got to bring you up to this because so many times the Bible seems to contradict itself, where there's many places where the prophets of old days saw God face to face. They saw him. But as we will prove in other chapters that we will deal mainly with that aspect of it, where it's talking about the face of something, it's relating to these great ships. And as I maintain, they were taken to a great space station that is rotating, just like this earth. And when they, the Hebrew word for face means the turning part of whatever object that they are talking about there. And I believe beyond the shadow of a doubt what he was saying to Moses, and they have translated this wrongly. He was telling Moses that you cannot live on the face of this apparent planet or this space station, because we will show you later on that it was several hundred degrees of heat on the surface, the outside of it. So a man could not look upon, or in other words, he could not live on the face of the outside of it. And as we see here, he spoke from within this Mount Sinai. Now, let's see, allow me to, let's look at it from the Farrar Fenton translation. Now Moses, however, was shepherding the sheep of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. He led the sheep to the far side of the desert, and he came to the mountain of God. But we're going to find out that these are in the incorrect order. Now you notice James Moffat just called it a hill, and here for our he calls it the mountain of God. And in Exodus, in the 19th chapter, I believe, they talk about the mount of God. Use it, I forget, 17, 19 times. Then they switched to mountain, which in the Hebrew did not mean a mountain in that instance. As it was erroneous translated, it was talking about something high up. So he came to the mountain of God, and then the translators put in the word in Horeb. The mountain of God was Horeb, another ancient corruption for the word Sinai. And Sinai, we're not talking about the Sinai replica that David established or tried to establish here on earth, but it was talking about from the very throne of God, the place from which he rules. Sinai means the government, and it's from there that the laws of the Ten Commandments were given to Moses to bring down to the people of earth. And then it goes on to say he came to the mountain of God in Horeb. In other words, he went into this Sinai, this space station, where a messenger of the ever-living appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush. When he saw that the bush was burnt with fire, yet the bush was not consumed, then Moses said, I'll draw near and examine the great wonder, why the bush is not burnt up. But the Lord saw that he approached to examine it. So God called to him from the midst, now get it, from the midst or the inside of Sinai, and said, Moses, Moses. He answered, I am here. Then he said, approach not, put off your shoes from off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy. Then he continued, I am the God of your fathers, and etc., so forth. So what we have, the translators have messed it all up. First he meets this extraterrestrial messenger, and this ship erroneously translated the bush. And then he told him to get ready to take off in the shoes, not your shoes. As we will learn later on, it was describing in the Hebrew. We give you a chapter and verse and Strong's, where to go find it. It describes it as an iron ship with the driver on the inside of it. So he said, get ready to take off in the shoes. And then a lot of this has been cut out, because the next thing you know, he's in this Mount Sinai, and he meets the Almighty face to face. Now, in case any of you think that my interpretation, as you will probably call it, talking about the face of the planet, and you will deny the fact that I'm stating here that Moses, who is probably the greatest, one of the greatest men of the Old Testament, he was the leader of Israel for his time. And when I say that he met him face to face, and you may doubt this, allow me to turn and quote to you from the James Moffat translation. Let's quote from 32 and 24, and starts here. It talks about Jacob was left alone. The man struggled with him till the break of day. When the man found that he could not master him, he struck the hollow of his thigh, so that Jacob's thigh was sprained in the wrestle. Then he said, let me go, for the day is breaking, and I will not, said Jacob, unless you bless me. What is your name? Said the man. Jacob, he answered. Then your name shall be Jacob no longer, said the man, but Israel. And then he puts in parentheses, striver with God. And he goes on to say, for you have striven with God and men and won. Now tell me what name you bear, said Jacob. Why, now this mysterious stranger that he wrestled with, this messenger, this apparent angel he'd wrestled with all night, he said, why ask my name, he said, and blessed him on the spot. And Jacob named the spot Peniel, which means God's face, saying, I have seen God face to face, yet I am alive. So once again, let's remind you that, let's see, what was it? Allow me, I quoted you from Exodus 19. Remind me of the 12th verse here. It talks about, in the 11th verse it tells about, and the Lord came down in the sight of all the people in the Mount Sinai ship here. And then the Almighty says in the 12th verse, thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about them, saying, take heed to yourself that you go not up into the mount, or touch the borders of it. Whoever touches it, the mount shall be surely put to death. No, the Almighty wasn't going to send an angel out there to cut your head off. As we explained, this is talking about radiation, and we do a whole chapter on this that you'll may want to listen to. It was entitled St. Paul's Radiation Burns, and we go into greater depth. But they were warned not to go up into this great mount ship, and then so we see why the Almighty sent the messenger, the angel, to get Moses, and then it would appear that he screams to him from some high, lofty mountaintop. Not so. Note it said that he called Moses from the midst of Sinai. Now, let's go back for just a moment to Moses' first encounter when he said, approach not, put off your shoes from off your feet, for this place on which you stand is holy. He continued, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, he feared to gaze upon God. Well, the foregoing was just several encounters that Moses was to have with extraterrestrials, and not only was he to meet them on several occasions, and we find, if not thousands or tens of thousands, maybe it was, there seems to be a lot of controversy over how many people were with Moses, so I'll say just witnessed by tens of thousands of Israelites that were to follow Moses later on in the story. But we find that Moses was flown to this mysterious Sinai Mount in a mount ship on more than one occasion. But the readers of these people with all these sophisticated computer equipment, if they would just feed it in there, and they would see that mount ship, the Mount of Sinai, a ship from that great mount, from the rock, from the house of God. And these words, eagles and Sioux and horses and mounts, boy, their head all gets in a tizzy. Well, listen, I had a terrible time with algebra and mathematics, and to this day I still get mental indigestion over it. But here we don't have that many things to add up. If someone just points them out to us and we look for them and we follow it through and we get suspicious of them, and we realize that you wouldn't call any mountain on this earth holy. You wouldn't call any hill on it holy. Now, Moses goes without saying that he was a great mount of God, and this extraterrestrial, he was a special pilot. But their presence did not make this earth or any spot on it holy. So this proves that Moses had yet to reach this place that was called holy. Now you can see where the translators, they switched the paragraphs. The pilot warned Moses to get ready to take off in the Sioux, not the shoes. It was a Sioux ship, as we will take the Hebrew itself to prove it. See, it really was a flying space station of such a gigantic proportion that it would boggle the minds of even the wildest 21st century Star Trekkie. We will present proof here that Moses was only the first of many earthlings to take journeys to outer space, to other worlds. And for the doubting Thomas, we're going to cite accounts from other cultures and historical records of men flying from this planet to other places in space. And we're just starting with Moses. But there were other men even long before Moses, and we'll cover this in other chapters. The Egyptians, they had their own endless accounts of lords and gods coming and going in outer space. And they had what we would call, and this is what they called it, breaking it down into the most modern English I can, paraphrasing, they had a type of solar religion, and their gods and lesser gods and greater gods, they're too numerous to list at this time. We know, of course, that their chief god was Ra. He traveled throughout space in a solar ship. And we find that the pyramid text of the old kingdom of Egypt, that of the most ancient antiquity of Egypt, it told of heavenly journeys by the kings, obviously made with the help of extraterrestrial lords of these solar crafts. One cannot study the history of Egypt without reading these endless accounts of the kings being involved in flying. Now, it may disturb the religious of the Western world to think that the God of Moses or Jesus had the right to the air space. Yet in the 5th chapter of Zechariah, we read that a messenger here, translated angel by the Greeks, he tells Zechariah to look at a ship landing. The ship possibly describes the size of a two-man ship that shuttled Moses to this great extraterrestrial space station called the Holy Mount, but I believe that there was a larger ship waiting overhead that he ascended to. Now, we find in the 3rd chapter of Exodus is mistranslated, and the verses once again are not in the proper chronological sequence. As we return to Moses and Jethro, starting with the very first verse of Exodus here, quoting from the King James Version, we won't repeat this where he's talking about their flocks, but then, let's see here, Midian, he was led the flock to the backside of the desert from the King James point of view now, because I know a lot of the listeners, that's what they used, and they're going to be upset if I ignore the old King James. Now, there should be a period after the word desert rather than a comma. At this point, it was the translators, they transposed these sentences and paragraphs, and the remainder of the verse is, and he came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. Now, the Israelites, as well as other nations, we find that they name places after the abode of the so-called gods on other planets, such as the Greek Mount Olympus and Mars Hill. That, remember, the Greeks named that, and Paul, he spoke of it, I believe it was Acts 17 and 22. Strong's Concordance says Arios, Pegos, from Ares, the name of the Greek deity of war, or the Rock of Ares, a place in Athens named after the planet, and which Paul was referring to, named after the extraterrestrial messenger Pegasus, to Mars Hill on this earth. Now, we find then that it was Strong's Concordance that tells us possibly from P-A-G-N-U-M-I, Panubia. It means to set up a tent. Keep in mind this clue as you live inside of a tent. Now, note also that they use the word rock referring to extraterrestrial locations, and we find the Christians singing of the Rock of Ages, and people brag in their ministry about standing on the rock. And the Catholic Church, and it's been picked up by the Protestant Church, they'll argue, well, the rock was Jesus and the rock was Peter, and the Catholic Church tells us that God established everything on Peter. Well, remember, Peter was a man like you and I, and there is a list of his weaknesses and of his shortcomings, but yet through all of this adversity it tells of his great overcoming and the great deeds, but still it was based on something higher than and greater than Peter. We find in the life and the times of Moses and their people, there was no special mountain named after their God. They didn't even know the name of their God. Keep that in mind. That's a great clue. Paul was always telling them that they knew of the rock and where it was, but they forgot his name and the one who sits there. We find it very odd, you might say, how the story, it switches from sheep herding to telling us Moses came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. Now, this sentence comes later. The translator slipped over any explanation of how he arrived there. They just place him immediately at the mountain. Later, they tell that he's talking with the messenger and then with God, and then write about the trip, then the arrival at the abode of God. Now, as we pursue many different examples of the use and the misuse of the word mountain here, most of the time mountain does not mean a high hill or a mountain like Mount Everest. As it's used in the original Hebrew, it's referring to something high up in space. And the word Horeb has confused us for many centuries, some thinking that it was a term for Sinai. Even most of the Hebrew concordances thought it referred to Sinai. Well, even I have been wrong. Not so. The reason I equated it the same, I know that I made a mistake back there, and let me clear it up at this point. So we'll get the connection, and man has failed to understand it. Horeb, it refers to a desert, or the meaning is great empty space. So what they did, they put them together, and you have a place high up, surrounded by empty space. Now, how did Moses arrive there? It sounds like the sentence of verse 1 should follow the writings about the messenger who meets Moses at the so-called bush. Once again, it says Moses came to the mountain of God. Where was that mountain of God, and how did Moses get there? He could not get there from this earth unless you believe God lives in a mountain in the desert. Now, Sinai means the seat of government, also the house or the residence of the Almighty. And throughout our tapes, we show the evidence, or Sinai, the house of the Almighty is called by dozens of different names. And before I forget it, we have to remember that, like the ancient Egyptians, as we study their translated works of the ancient hieroglyphics and so forth, they talked about Ra, and they knew in order to get back to Ra and what they call the house of life, the same place in which Moses went. They talked about crossing the great sea. Now, the sea was talking about the sea of space, and many times they referred to it as like a desert